Hello. My name's Sarah Jane Critchley. I'm an author, speaker, consultant, and coach, and I'm the founding partner of A Different Joy. And I am going to talk to you today. I'm so excited to speak to you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to talk to you today about women and girls, diagnosis, gender, sexuality, and relationships. And before we go on, I'm just going to share my screen with you to make sure that you can see the whole of the presentation. And just to let you know that I'll be sending a copy of the slides to you, Usha, as well, so that you have all of the information that you could possibly need. And there's lots of references and different things in this presentation. So it will make it easier for you to follow what we're talking about. So without further ado, let's get cracking. So I mentioned that I'm an author, speaker, consultant, and coach. I have 2 adult autistic children. I identify as an autistic woman, and I'm married to an autistic man. And we've been married and together for, oh heavens, we've been married for 30 years. We've been together for over 35 now. So that's quite a while, really. So if anybody tells you that you can't be autistic and manage relationships, they're not telling you the truth. I'm showing you this picture because one of the lovely things that I got to do whilst I was part of the Autism Education Trust, where I worked to support autistic people in schools and to help teachers and those working with them to do it better, was to be part of the Autistic Girls Forum. And this lovely group of people got together to try and improve things for autistic girls and women, because we understood that the position that they're in was very dire, that autistic girls and women were often least to be recognised and least supported as well. So we wanted to find a better way forward. And I know as part of your lovely conference, you're having a presentation from Robin Stewart. She's in the middle with the hat on. And the little lady at the front is actually my daughter, Beth, who's also autistic. And you possibly recognise this lovely lady with the red hair. That's Carrie Grant from The One Show, and we'll talk a little bit more about her and some of the other people in our presentation later. So let's start off talking about what the definitions are for autistic girls and how you're identified as being an autistic girl. Well, there are lots of different ways of doing that, but at the moment, the NICE guidelines, which is the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, tells doctors and practitioners what they should do in order to decide whether somebody meets a diagnosis or not. The only problem with that is that the books that they use to decide whether somebody's autistic or not are usually one of these 2. So the first one is called DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, and that's an American book that looks at a whole range of different mental health conditions, and it decides whether somebody meets that criteria and what the criteria is, what they have to be like in order to get a diagnosis. And then there's a European one called ICD-11, which is based on the American one. So they're basically the same. But the problem is that the tools, the questions that people ask when they're deciding whether or not you're autistic don't actually pick up girls very well, because they're based around a really old-fashioned way of looking at autism, which assumed that it was usually boys and assumed that it was usually boys of a very particular type. And what it did was that it didn't recognise the sort of things that girls do and that women do. And it would ask questions like, does he spin the wheels on his toy car? Or does he line up his train engines? And it wouldn't look at the sort of things that girls do, like lining up their Barbies, like having a full collection of things. And we'll talk about some of the other things that might be an indicator later. It's also well known that girls tend to make eye contact more frequently than boys do. Autistic girls and women do that. And it's partly because we've had an entire entire lifetime of being expected to be social, of being expected to be the ones who manage families and who say where we're going to go and what we're going to do and how we actually arrange our lives, and to make all of that work. All of that tends to fall on the woman or the girl. And so we are taught from a very early age to fit in and to do what is expected. And unless you're one of those really strong-willed people who doesn't, then that may well be you. So there are a number of diagnostic differences. These are my two. The girl is Beth and the boy is Alex. When they were very little, they're now both grown up now. They're both adult, and they've given me permission to share their story as part of what I'm doing today. And sometimes they talk with me as well. But today we're talking about the differences between boys and girls. So historically, in the old days, we used to think that there was perhaps one girl for every 4 boys. But actually now we think that's not the case. We think it's probably somewhere between 1 girl to 2 boys who are diagnosed with autism. And we are now recognizing that girls are possibly even more common on the end of the spectrum, where people have average or above average intelligence when measured on an IQ test or something like that. Historically, it was only girls who couldn't speak or who had very profound communication difficulties who would have been diagnosed. But that's changing, and it is improving, but it takes a while. And because the questions that doctors ask are geared towards men and boys, girls and women are often diagnosed with other things first, or with the wrong things first. They're looking at the way that girls and women behave and thinking that that is an indication of something else other than autism. And many, many girls and women were not diagnosed at all. And nowadays, we're seeing more and more and more girls and women coming forward and identifying that they are autistic. And it's still really difficult to get a formal diagnosis if you're a girl or a woman. But that is increasing, and it is getting slightly easier. The other thing to bear in mind is that lots of girls and women who end up in eating disorder services, who have anorexia or bulimia, also meet the criteria for being autistic. So their eating serves at control serves a different purpose to if the purpose that it would serve if they weren't autistic. So there are many, many more girls and women than we have previously identified as being autistic. And what we discovered through doing lots of surveys is that girls are far less likely to be diagnosed, and that actually, even when they are diagnosed, they're far more likely to be impacted much, much more severely than a boy or a man would be in order to achieve a diagnosis, in order to get a diagnosis. So what are the differences between boys and girls? So boys tend to have more repetitive behaviours, more flapping, more tapping, more vocal tics, that sort of thing. And more girls have been recognised with intellectual disabilities, with lower levels of IQ than boys have. There are also more girls that have epilepsy as well as autism, and we're not quite sure why that's the case, it just is. And we think that parents are much less aware that their daughter is struggling in groups and socially than their son. And we think that's often because girls and women will mask their difficulties and will act as if it is all okay so that they look a bit more normal, whatever normal may be. So let's talk a little bit about how autism can look different in girls and women. And this is particularly around special interests. So special interests are very different in girls and women. And often the special interest tends to be more mainstream. So it tends to be, rather than being something like trains or dinosaurs or Otis lifts or something very specific and very niche, interests in girls and women tend to be more mainstream. So often there'll be things like knowing absolutely everything about a particular celebrity, and in a huge amount of depth. It could be about a program on TV or somebody who's a star in that program. Lots of autistic people I know are fabulous with animals and know a huge amount those, and many train as veterinary nurses or vets and things like that. Sometimes an autistic girl will have a special interest of their friend. So if, for example, you're at school and you have just one friend, and that one friend is really important to you, you may know absolutely everything about them. You may dive into them and follow them as if they're a special interest in their own right. Or that could, in fact, happen with your boyfriend. Certainly, lots of women that I know historically would have changed their interests, changed the things they're looking at, become passionate about things that their partner is passionate about. And that's all fine and dandy if the partner or the friend or the girlfriend is lovely and kind and friendly and wonderful. If that person is less lovely, kind, friendly, and wonderful, it can leave our young lady or our young woman much more vulnerable. And that's something we have to think about specifically. And I'll come on to a few things that we can do that will help and give you more information in a bit. So let's just think about other interests that there might be. Lots and lots and lots of people I know love Japanese manga and anime, and comics and cosplay are also a very particular thing that's really, really popular. And cosplay is marvelous because it gives you a way of expressing yourself, your identity, in a safe environment, in a really accepting environment where you know what the questions are going to be, you know what the answers are going to be, and it makes the world doable for you. So why are girls in autism so rarely recognised? We think it's really that the way we expect girls and women to behave means that they behave in a way that isn't so noticeable, and it doesn't look as different, and it looks more like what non-autistic people do. And if you're looking at diagnosis, the perception of girls and women is different. So if a boy is socially awkward, a professional would often think, oh, they might be autistic. If a girl is socially awkward, they tend to think that the girl is either shy or they think that she's really anxious. They don't tend to think automatically of autism. So let's just think now about what that lived experience is like. We're going to talk a bit about friendships, and then we're going to go on to talk about gender. And often the story that we have again and again in our lives is of somebody who's trying really hard to fit in, but doesn't quite match the others. That's why I love this little fluffy duckling. I like this fluffy duckling. She makes me happy. And so often what we want is just somebody to hang around with and have a nice time with, who's got the same sort of interests and enjoys what we enjoy. And there's something so passionately important about finding your tribe, finding the people who work for you and the people that you want to be with and be like. And that can be life-changing to find that. But that isn't always the case. And this quote came from a woman who said she's lonely. She recognizes she's different. She sees others getting together and she'd like to be a part of it. But her experience isn't that. So what would make a good friend? So a friend is someone who would fight for you, who'd respect you, who would include you, encourage you, need you, deserve you, and stand by you. Because you can have good friendships and bad friendships. And there's a world of difference between having a friend who just doesn't do everything that you would like them to do and having a friend who is actively mean or unpleasant or persuades you to try and do things that are unsafe. And if in doubt, find a trusted friend or a trusted other person to talk to and just say, does this seem right to you? Because this person's asking me to do such and such. Because somebody who is really your friend will never ask you to do anything that isn't in your best interests, that isn't something that's good for you and that will make you happy and safe and proud. But that's not always the experience for our autistic girls and women. And in terms of friendships, what we often see is an autistic girl might want to be with other people, more so than autistic men and boys, but might struggle to do that. And she may have one or two particular friends, but maybe not a big group. Often she'll operate at the fringes of the group. She'll kind of hang back and she'll watch everybody else and she'll see what they're doing and how they're dressing and what they're saying. And then often she'll mimic it, or she'll act it, or she'll try and copy what they're doing in order to fit in. And what that does is it leaves her very vulnerable to being manipulated and people taking advantage. It leaves her very vulnerable to being exploited by her friends or less scrupulous people. And often she'll be getting it wrong. And that's heartbreaking because it just makes you feel rubbish. And that can happen at any age. It's not something that happens just to girls. And what this shows is a pattern of people who are trying really, really hard to get it right in terms of friendships, but often that not working. So we have amazing compensation skills. We make a massive difference, but it's just exhausting. And so what you probably want to do is to actually manage your capacity very carefully to make sure that you have enough energy to do that social activity, because it's really tiring. So what's the difference between girls' friendships, boys' friendships, and bullying? So Dr. Felicity Sedgwick did a fantastic piece of research into gender and friendships and relationships and looked at how that worked over a lifetime as well as children. And what she discovered is that girls can have strong friendships and that can be really protective. And it helps, if you're with somebody, you're much less likely to be picked on by somebody else. So there is a safety factor about having a friend, whether you're a boy or a girl, that means that you're less likely to be bullied. And boys and girls tend to bully and to be bullied in very different ways. So boys will often get quite physical, will get quite aggressive and may hit. Girls will tend more to excluding somebody else or to saying nasty things about them or to just being plain mean more than being physical. And that's not to say girls don't ever do that, but they do it less often. And autistic teenagers, we found in the study, were far more likely to be bullied. And the people who are most likely to be bullied were autistic girls. And autistic boys and girls have very different types of friendships. So boys tend to have friendships that are based around activities or things that they do together, and it's more about kind of rubbing along together and having a good time in the same space. Girls tend to have much closer relationship-based friendships that are more to do with the friendship than they are about what's happening around it. But that means that when these friendships go wrong, it can be absolutely devastating. It's devastating in different ways. So a boy or man will often just go and find somebody else in a different group, and that will be less of an issue for them. Girls and women tend to feel the loss and the pain of a friendship gone wrong very, very deeply indeed. And that can make it really, really difficult in teenage years, particularly because at times when you're at school, girls fall out with each other all the time. That's what happens. It's a normal part of development. But what happens when you get older? What's it like as an autistic woman? Well, one of the things that Felicity found was that friendship can be hard, even an adult. You know, those friendship skills we develop, and we develop them by learning, but we get things wrong. And it's absolutely awful when we get things wrong. I mean, I had an example not very long ago, personally, where I just misinterpreted and done the wrong thing. I hadn't done anything particularly evil, or I did it for the best of intentions, but I really hurt a friend of mine, and I didn't mean to at all. And it's devastating when you get it wrong. But that has happened less as I've got older. And it's been a long time since it happened before. So we learn how to do these things as we get older. And as we get older, the other thing that happens is that romantic relationships and how wanting to have a relationship with somebody who we have an interest beyond friendship becomes more and more important. And as we get older, we tend to be kind of more happy and settled in our relationships, and those work well. But again, getting people wrong, getting that relationship wrong, leaves autistic women highly, highly vulnerable. One of the things that's been recently found in a very new piece of research that came out was that, late breaking news and not very surprising, autistic people were less likely to be straight than not people who weren't autistic. And there was an online study, quite a big study actually, that found that autistic men were more likely to be bisexual than non-autistic men. NT means neurotypical or non-autistic. And autistic women were more likely to be gay than non-autistic women. They also found, in terms of women specifically, that they were more likely than autistic men to have a wider range of sexual orientation, and I'll go through some of what those would be, except being homosexual, which is the most common category for autistic men. They were more likely to engage in sexual activity than autistic men, and they were more likely to start having sex at an earlier age. And one of the things to reflect on is that whether you're male or female, it doesn't matter, that we have the opportunity to try on different identities. And I've mentioned teenage here specifically because developmentally, for all people, teenage is a time where you're kind of pushing those boundaries and you're trying to work out who you are. And that happens massively during teenage years. Now, if you're autistic, like me and lots of the people I know and love, it takes longer to work out your identity, to work out who you are, to work out if you're gay or straight, if you're bi or trans, if you're male or female, to work out what's going on in your body, what's going on in your head, what's going on in your heart, who you love, who you're attracted to, what you want to do, what you don't want to do, what you like, what you don't like. All of that takes time. And teenage is now a brilliant time for trying on identities. And now, as opposed to when I was younger, where you kind of had very set roles and very little choice about them, now you've got very many more options to try and different things to have a go with and see what fits you best. And that's really quite a wonderful thing, I think. And there are so many more options to explore. So we've talked a little bit about personal identity, and that isn't always about sex or gender. Sometimes it's about things you like to wear. It's about things you like to do. It's about jobs you might like to do, how you want to spend your time. It could be about your style. You might love wearing Japanese fashion, for example. You might love wearing loose and baggy clothes like a skater boy. You might want to be exploring what your gender is. You know, do you feel inside your body as if you're male or female? And exploring your sexuality. Who are you attracted to? Who do you find gives you that little frisson? Who really turns you on and makes you feel that really strong attraction to them? And it's a really good time to explore. And there's more, it feels like there's so many more options on the table these days that people can be more themselves. And I think the fact that many, many more autistic people are identified as being not typical in terms of their gender and sexual identity just shows how we don't necessarily buy into society's norms and have more freedom to explore. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And I think part of that is around thinking about old-fashioned gender roles and whether or not we accept them. And some people do and love them, and that's fine. And some people really don't, and that's fine too. So, for example, I identify as a female, as a woman, but I do not want to identify with the role that this lovely blonde lady is doing, because she's basically there doing a very sexy pose to excite men or women who like that sort of sexy pose, I suppose. And I wouldn't want to be objectified in that way. That is a role I reject actively. I don't dress like that. I choose not to dress like that because I'm rejecting that role. If I were a man, I may not want to wear a shirt and tie. I may feel more comfortable in a pair of jogging bottoms or sports kit. I may feel more comfortable in a dress or something very flamboyant or something with sequins. Any of those. This may not be me in that sort of scenario. I certainly would reject personally the gender roles. I don't identify with this scantily clad game-based chick in the middle. And if I was a bloke, I might not identify with the big warrior dude with his huge muscles and his big sword either. I might identify more as the guy on the left. You know, we have a choice. And I think lots of us now are just saying that role isn't for me. And for some people, this kind of rose-tinted family isn't what we want to do. And that's okay too. And if it is what you want to do, go for it. But you have to find people who want to participate with you, if that's part of what you want to do. But many, many autistic young women have just said that there's an issue with gender and they're just not good at being a girl. But trying to define what being a girl isn't as simple as it looks. It's not about the outfit you wear or the role you perform always. It's more complicated than that. So why is it so difficult? Let's just have a little talk about that for a minute. So there are so many things about being autistic that make your whole body and what's going on inside your body and how you feel about your body and what it is doing really difficult. So we don't like change, do we? We really don't like change. So there we are as a nice young person enjoying ourselves at school, and then we're going on towards secondary school, and all of a sudden things start changing. We start growing hair in places we didn't want to grow hair. We start growing bits of body that we hadn't planned. And that whole change thing can be incredibly uncomfortable. And nobody bothered asking us if we wanted to have it that way, did they? It just all happened. So lots of us really struggle with the changes that happen naturally as a part of natural human development at puberty. And if you're autistic and you don't have a really strong sense of your body and how it works, and you're not comfortable in your body, that can be a really scary process. And it makes being at one with yourself, comfortable in your own skin, really difficult. There are lots of problems with hormonal changes. So anyone who's a woman or girl will recognize the hormone roller coaster that we go over throughout the month. And there'll be certain times in the month before you have your period where your hormones are really high and you turn into the witch queen from hell. Well, maybe that's just me. That is definitely me. And there are other times where you feel quite calm and quite predictable. And for many girls and women, the fear of pregnancy is a huge thing. That's a massive body change. When I was pregnant, I felt like I'd been taken over by an alien, which in a way I kind of had, because you're growing a whole human inside you. It's a massive, amazing sensory overload thing. Lots of us have sensory issues with clothing. Often men's clothing is softer than girls' and women's. That is annoying, especially if you like loose clothing. That's sometimes wearing men's clothing is more comfortable. So not knowing what to wear can be really difficult. If you are trans, and I'll come on to what being trans is in a minute, and you identify as a different gender to the body that you've been born into, trying to work out where to go to the toilet can be a bit of an event, and it makes it all really difficult and sometimes a bit scary. And then there's the fact that when you grow into being a woman, you suddenly stop being this child and you suddenly start being noticed by grown men. And that can be a really difficult thing to cope with. And some men think it's okay to give you unwanted attention, to look at you, to talk to you, and sometimes to touch you without permission, and that's not okay. So that makes it all really quite difficult to progress our way through. So there are lots of different things to think about in terms of sex and gender. And the first thing, let's just think about sex. And I'm not thinking about sex act, I'm thinking about the sex that you were born. And the sex that you were born is a sex that you are assigned at birth. And how do people know? How do you know what sex you are? Well, when you go have a baby, you have what's called an ultrasound or a pre-birth scan. And sometimes at that scan, they can tell you what the baby's going to be when it arrives. So they've got a picture of this baby in your womb, and they can see various bits on the baby. So if they think it's a boy, they'll normally see a penis. They won't always be as clear about if it's a girl, because there's less to see. So you can't guarantee that that would be correct. But sometimes they'll identify if it's a boy. Then when the child's actually born, the doctor and nurse will look at them and say, "Congratulations, Mrs. Critchley, it's a healthy baby human." Or in our case, the first one was a healthy baby girl and the second one was a healthy baby boy. And that's based around the body parts that you have. And normally, if you have a penis, then you're a man. If you don't have a penis, you're a woman, or you're a girl, rather. But some people have bits of both, and it isn't as clear cut as that. So we'll come on to that in a little bit. But predominantly, you can normally tell that that would be your sex at birth. The other way of telling somebody's sex is that there is a genetic code inside every single cell in your body, the tiniest parts of every bit of your body, that is hardwired, and it says whether you have an XX chromosome, which is what it is if you're a girl or a woman, or an XY, which is what it is if you're a man or a boy. And that is fairly straightforward. But that doesn't automatically mean that you have the body parts to go with that. It normally does, but other things go wrong in the womb sometimes. And the other way of telling, and if any of you are sports fans, you might know about this. So in sport, they will sometimes do hormone testing. And if you're a boy or a man, you normally have higher levels of testosterone, which is the male sex hormone. And if you're a female or a girl or a woman, you would have higher levels of estrogen, which is the female hormone. But hormones can be changed, and hormones can vary depending on what you're doing. And some people have abnormally high levels of testosterone as a woman, and some men have abnormally high levels of estrogen as a man. So it's not quite as simple as it seems. But basically, sex is usually the body that you're born into and the bits that you have. That's the easy way of thinking about it. And it's written on your birth certificate. And this one says boy. So what's all this stuff about gender then? Let's just dive into that for a little bit. So your gender identity is how you feel inside your body. So irrespective of the body bits you have, do you feel that you're a female, a woman, or a girl? I love this picture of the gender unicorn. I think it's a really good way of thinking through these things. Or do you feel like you're a male and that you're a man or a boy? Or do you identify as something else? Are you just non-binary? You're not either male or female, you're just something else. Any of those is okay, and you can be anywhere along that spectrum. And then there's the gender expression. So how do you express yourself? How do you come over? What sort of type of gender do you like to show to other people? And some people would express themselves as being very feminine. So maybe they speak very softly, maybe they wear feminine type clothing. They express themselves in a very feminine way. Other people would express themselves as very masculine. They may speak very clearly and very forcefully, and they may choose typically male type clothing, and they may like typically male type things. And then there is those people who prefer not to identify as either of those, and they may express themselves in a more androgynous way, which means not easily identified as one or the other. So it could be either. We've talked a little bit about sex assigned as birth. People who don't have either clear male or female body parts, or who have both clearly, can be identified as intersex. And that's called intersex, which is a third gender. And then the next thing to think about is, who are you attracted to physically? Who makes you feel, gives you that stirring in your loins, gives you that stirring in your belly and makes you think, they're a bit of all right. And Are you physically attracted to women? Are you physically attracted to men? Are you physically attracted to people who are neither female nor male? Or is it not important to you? Is the physical attraction not something that matters to you? And then the final bit to think about is, who are you emotionally attracted to? Who do you feel safe with? Who do you enjoy spending time with? Who's most fun to you to be with? So where do you get that emotional feedback? Is it from women? Is it from men? Or is it from other genders or people who don't identify as either male or female? And that's a really good way of kind of just plotting where you feel. And these things can change. You know, it doesn't have to be all one or all another. And there's a thing called gender fluid, which means that sometimes you may identify as more female, or sometimes you may identify as more male, and sometimes you may not identify as either at all. And that's known as being gender fluid. So let's just think about, this is how the gender expression, I wanted to give you some examples. So the gentleman here is called Elliot Page, and Elliot has recently transitioned to being male. Elliot used to be known as Ellen Page, and is a star of the Umbrella Academy. So they're listed as Ellen Page in the earlier versions of the Umbrella Academy, but in the latest version, he will be identified as Elliot Page, and he's come out as being trans. This person, if any of you are really old, you might remember Boy George, who presented as quite effeminate at the time and had a very different presentation, although he is clearly male. This gentleman up at the top is Eddie Izzard. Eddie changes how they wish to be referred to from day to day, actually. So Eddie has always enjoyed wearing lipstick and nail varnish, but sometimes Eddie identifies as a man and sometimes Eddie identifies as being a woman, and that's absolutely fine. Those of you who are really old might remember David Bowie as Ziggy Stardust, which was a whole different ball of wax. So he was dressing in a very non-binary way, in a very androgynous way, in a way that wasn't clearly male or female. And some of those outfits were quite exciting. And the lady on the left is Annie Lennox, who always had a very androgynous way of presenting. So she was never clearly identified as male or female. You can see she's wearing a typically male jacket, typically male shirt and tie, but more typically female eye makeup and makeup for her face. So in that way, she's kind of androgynous. She's not identifying very strongly as either male or female. So I want to give you some examples of these wonderful things called LGBTQIA. And there's lots of overlapping types of identity and sexuality, and all of these are perfectly okay. There's nothing wrong with any of these. It's perfectly okay. And if you identify as being completely straight and heterosexual, that's fine too. But I wanted to explain what the sort of things you might be looking at and give you some examples. So someone who's a lesbian is someone who's attracted to women. And there's a fantastic example in Hannah Gadsby, who's an amazing autistic female comic. She had a show called Nanette, which is really, really good. I think it's on Netflix still, so it's worth looking at. An example of someone who's gay would be either a man or a woman who's attracted to someone who's the same sex as them. So an example of that is Lil Nas X, who's a rapper, and he's really brave actually, being someone who's out as a gay man in an environment where almost nobody is gay. So it's really, really unusual that he's taken that role, and he's done some brilliant stuff, done really well. So what about being bisexual or bi? Now that means you're attracted to people of more than one gender. And an example of this would be Alan Cumming. He's an actor, and he has been identified in long-term relationships with both a man and a woman separately. So he's had a relationship with a wife, he's had a relationship with a husband. They've been together for a long time. And that's what it means to be bi. If someone is transgender or trans, they're someone whose gender doesn't match the body bits that they were given at birth. And there's a fantastic actress called Laverne Cox. I don't know if any of you have seen Orange is the New Black. She's one of the stars of that show and does a brilliant job at that, and has been out for a long, long time. Someone who identifies as queer is someone who identifies as being generally just not straight, and who may not identify with any of the other labels. So that's one of the options that's available. Jamila Jamil, who was in The Good Place, she identifies as queer. Someone who's intersex, we talked a little bit earlier, someone whose body wasn't either male or female, wasn't just male or just female. There's a phenomenal supermodel called Hannah Gaby Odile, and they actually do lots of campaigning for intersex people. Historically, when intersex people were born, a doctor would make a decision and say, this is a boy or this is a girl. And they would then potentially even have surgery to assign them to a particular gender without their consent, historically without even the consent of a parent necessarily. But now people like Hannah are standing up for the rights of intersex people to make their own choices at a time when they feel they want to, or not at all, and that's okay. Another thing is to be asexual. So thinking about sexuality rather than identity here is someone who experiences either little or no sexual attraction at all. And there are quite a few people who do that. So there's an example here from Evan Edinger, who's a really good YouTuber who writes about American and English education systems. He's actually really, really funny. He's fantastic. And then there's pansexual people. And this is someone for whom they don't care what gender is in terms of being attracted to them. They're attracted to the person, not to the gender. So they wouldn't ever say, oh, I can't fancy them because they're not a whatever, because that's not what's important to them. And Cara Delevingne is an example of that. She's an actress and a singer, and very successful lady she is too. There's a whole thing about gender dysphoria and if you're feeling really uncomfortable in your own body, and how that works. So if you're not really attached to your body, you have a sense of unease, a real sense of panic, and a sense that things are fundamentally wrong, that you are not born into the body that you should be. So being born into a female body and feeling that you're definitely a man, or being born into a male body and feeling that you're definitely female. That's something that can be so intense and so difficult that people can really, really struggle. And there is treatment for gender dysphoria if you have that. It is more common in autistic people than in non-autistic people. Or rather, there's a much higher proportion of autistic people in comparison to the population, who have that sense. And I think it's partly because we struggle to feel really attached to our bodies in the same way because of issues with our sensory processing of internal messages from our body. And it can have a really bad impact on your daily life. I wanted to show you this film about Elliot and how he feels about his transition, just to explain the process of why somebody might want to do that to you.
It's getting out of the shower and the towel's around your waist and you're looking at yourself in the mirror and you're just like, there I am.
Elliot Page is opening up about his, quote, tears of joy after coming out as trans.
This is your first television interview as a trans man, Elliot Page.
In the trailer for the Oprah Conversation, airing April 30th, the Oscar-nominated actor gets emotional.
All the trauma aside that it took you to get here, the courage that it took you to stand within the truth of yourself and to do the thing that you've always known you needed to do. What part of your transition has actually brought you the most joy?
Goodness, what has brought me the most joy? The most joy. it's, getting out of the shower and the towels around your waist and you're looking at yourself in the mirror and you're just like, there I am.
The upcoming interview follows Elliot's announcement in December, and by every indication, the conversation will be a celebration of his journey so far.
And I'm not having the moment where I'm panicked. I'm not having all these little moments that used to be just being in a t-shirt. It's being able to touch my chest and feel comfortable in my body for probably the first time. Tears of joy.
In March, the Umbrella Academy star became the first transgender man to be featured solo on the cover of Time magazine. And the Oprah interview appears to be Elliot's latest move in shining a light on issues affecting the trans community.
What do you want to say to those who don't seem to think trans children dying matters?
In an interview with Vanity Fair, Elliot opened up about his decision to sit down with the talk show hosts. He calls the anti-trans rhetoric in our culture, quote, devastating, and points to the recent wave of controversial laws and bill proposals which have been criticized for targeting transgender youth. Elliot said talking to Oprah, quote, felt like an opportunity to use a wide-reaching platform to speak from my heart about some of my experience and the resources I've been able to access, whether therapy or surgery, that have allowed me to be alive, to live my life.
So it can be really difficult to be trans, to feel that you've been born into a body that isn't yours, that doesn't feel like yours. And some people really, really struggle with that. And it's really important for those around them to accept their journey and where they are in it, even if you don't agree. The rates of mental ill health and self-harm are very high in this population. But it's also important to recognise that not everybody who transitions from one gender to another feels that that is a long-term thing for them. Some people are now choosing to detransition and go back the other way. So it's important to reflect that even if it feels absolutely vital now, that may not always be the case. But there are lots of people who have transitioned and feel that that is exactly the place that they need to be. So there's an example here that I wanted to share with you, which is Lalo and Lily Wachowski. So any of you who are film buffs or love your films might have heard of the Matrix films, and they were done by the Wachowski brothers at the time. And the Wachowski brothers came out a long time ago now as being trans, and this is Lily and Lana. And they've also produced a show on Netflix called Sense8, which I do not recommend for anyone under the age of 18. It is very sexually explicit, but it is a show that talks about people being really strongly connected to each other and about gender and sexuality being far more fluid and being part of that picture. So this is what the Wachowski brothers used to look like, and this is how the Wachowski sisters are now. They've recently come out in the press to say that the Matrix is a trans metaphor. It's a metaphor for what it's like to have that life. So even if you're not gender dysphoric, even if you feel that you are definitely the gender that you're born into and you're perfectly happy with that, there is still a really strong overlap between autism and gender diversity. So interestingly, people who don't identify with the sex that they're assigned at birth were between 3 and 6 times more likely to be autistic. They weren't necessarily dysphoric about it. They weren't necessarily upset about it. They weren't necessarily feeling that it was catastrophic for them, but they were feeling that they weren't in the right body. Autistic people are far more likely to be gender diverse. And we call that being under the double rainbow. So it's under the gender rainbow and under the autism rainbow. So it's quite a nice way of thinking about it. I like that one. all of that can leave you very vulnerable in terms of trying to work out what your gender identity is, what your sexual identity is, what your life identity is, what sort of things you want, what sort of relationships you want, and how to manage that. And I think this book, for anybody who's female, or even actually for those who aren't female, is by Robin Stewart, The Independent Woman's Handbook for Super Safe Living on the Autism Spectrum. Is absolutely fantastic. And she explains about platonic friendships and sex and romantic relationships and how to manage all of those things. I highly, highly recommend it. And it's got some really good, useful tools to help you unpack those issues and work out when somebody's being a good friend and when they're not being a good friend, and how to navigate the things that you're comfortable with doing in terms of contact with somebody, and when to have sex with somebody, and what a romantic relationship is, and what works for you. So I highly, highly recommend that. I want to just show you this quick film about consent, because consent is around whether you give somebody permission to be close to you, to touch you, to do things with you, or for you to do things with them. And it's really important that you actually ask. So I'm going to play this for you now.
Day 26. I've completely blended in with these humans. My disguise is perfect. They are clueless. The most complicated thing for me is social interactions. That's the only thing that might still blow my cover. Like, sometimes my friends run up and hug me. But sometimes they don't want to be hugged or even touched at all. It's very confusing, and I don't want to hurt or scare anyone. I was told that no one should ever touch another human without asking them first. In nature, it's really quite easy understanding who doesn't want to be touched. Humans are different, and it isn't always easy to understand. You have to get consent before you touch anyone. That is, the human has to verbally agree. I always ask before I touch anyone. I need to remember that just because a human doesn't say no to physical contact does not mean he or she are consenting to be touched. You both have to verbally agree. They are always free to say no. And that's all right too. I am also free to say no when I don't want to be touched. No one can touch me against my will. Only I get to decide if I want someone to touch me. I can change my mind at any point, and so can the other person. If someone does touch me against my will, I tell the person to stop, and if they don't, I go find help from a trusted adult. It's important to remember that if someone does touch you without your permission, you aren't to blame. No one should touch you without your permission. I'm definitely getting the hang of this human stuff.
So that's not to suggest that you are anything like a bear, but it is quite a nice way of working out that you need to ask people if it's okay to do things with and to them. And people should be asking you too. And if they don't, you have the right to say no, and you have the right to go and find help. One of the most inspirational people I've come across is Dr. Wen Lawson. Wen was born Wendy many, many years ago. Wendy transitioned to being Wen in his 60s. And he came to talk to us in the Autistic Girls Forum. And one of the most important things he said, we said, if there were one thing that you would like us to tell people about gender and identity and transitioning, what would it be? And he said, just to stop and listen to what people are saying and to tell them that they have time. It takes time to understand who you are. It takes time to understand who you want. And he said it took him 60 years to realize that that was what he needed to do. And that's him and his wife. And they went through that whole process of identifying his gender and his identity and transitioning and going through that process. And if you get a chance to hear him, then do. I've got some really good sources of support for you here for all sorts of issues around gender and sexuality. And I'll leave those for you in the handout. And just to finish off, I wanted to run through several amazing autistic women and girls, because there are lots and lots and lots of phenomenal people. We've talked about Robin Stewart, and I think you've got a talk from her as part of your conference as well. There's the brilliant Temple Grandin, who has her special interest twofold. She has one special interest in cattle management, and she has another special interest in autism. And whenever she comes over to England, she divides her time equally between those two special interests and spends 50% on each. She's possibly the most famous autistic woman in the world. This lovely lady is Lana Grant. She's a birth doula and trainer for the Autism Education Trust in the past, and now independent consultant. And her special interests are her 6 children. She's married, she has 6 children, and she's absolutely wonderful. This is Wen. We've just talked about Wen. This lovely lady here is called Dr. Kate Fox. She's a stand-up comedian. She's a poet and a broadcaster. So if anybody tells you that autistic people aren't funny, they're talking absolute rot, because I know loads of really funny autistic people who are fantastic. This lovely lady here in the stripy top, that's Laura James. She wrote a book about autistic women called Odd Girl Out. The lady on the black background is a phenomenal entrepreneur called Katie Buckingham, and she won the backing of one of the dragons in the Dragon's Den. She runs a company that supports mental health in companies and rolls out mental health first aid. And she's an amazing entrepreneur. And the person at the top right is down here as Talia Grant, now known as Tylan Grant. And Tylan is an actor on Hollyoaks and is one of the first autistic actors to play an autistic role on a mainstream soap show. And a couple more people I want you to know about. Now, you might know this lady. She was otherwise known as the governess on The Chase. She was also in the I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. And the thing I loved most about that program was that she went on saying that she was autistic, and they knew that she was autistic, and the people who were out in the jungle with her did the most amazing job of supporting her and providing her with what she needed. And she did a phenomenal job of doing her very best to do all sorts of things that, frankly, wouldn't get me anywhere near. Wouldn't do that. Another lovely example here is the brilliant Carly Jane Jones getting her MBE. She's recently written a book on safeguarding for autistic girls and women, which is absolutely fantastic. And then you might just have heard of this young lady. And so this is Greta Thunberg on her way over the Atlantic to go and talk to the UN and to beard a certain Donald Trump in his den and to tell him that he wasn't doing a good enough job for the environment. All of whom are phenomenal people and have so much to bring and to contribute. And I wanted to share a few voices of autistic girls and women with you.
Autistic girls and women and their families, it's time to raise our voices.
Autism is okay to have. I think people need to know more about it.
If you meet an autistic person, please do not say that they look normal or that they are good at fooling people. This is not a compliment.
It's really difficult when people say, oh, I'm a little bit autistic, or they tell you that you don't look autistic.
I often feel misunderstood and people assume I'm okay because I look normal.
When something comes unexpectedly, it makes me melt down, like when they took away topic homework.
It's hard in the world. It's loud, it's bright.
We want acceptance and understanding that autism doesn't necessarily present the same way in girls as it does in boys, but that doesn't make it any less real.
I'm good at contortion.
What are you good at?
Shut up. I find it hard to sit still and concentrate. I was always excluded at school, and now I don't go.
I'm an autistic mum, and I would like more awareness raised within mainstream schools for my autistic children.
We want schools that work for everyone.
We want more awareness and autism-friendly places to go.
No one tells this girl what to do unless she wants to do it. it's hard for other family members to get it.
I struggle with a lot of anxiety.
Anxiety in autistic girls can have a big impact on what can or can't be achieved.
It's hard because I spend all my energy masking my autism instead of using it to learn at school.
I challenge you to live in a world where you're never allowed to finish what you're thinking and where you're never allowed to actually say everything that you want to say. I challenge you not to get angry, not to get annoyed, not to get fed up.
I'm exhausted every day from just trying to fit in.
I want to understand the links between autism and mental health.
It's hard because I get overwhelmed so easily. I'm a great big sister. I love Harry Potter, but I struggle with the muggles.
I'm autistic because it affects my brain and the way I might hurt people. People don't understand me.
My daughter's at university. She believes and I believe that anything is possible, especially with the right support. I'm really, really proud of her.
My strength is being able to hyper-focus. I've nearly finished a counselling degree and will be getting a Dean's Award at the end of this month.
Employers keep talking about flexible work opportunities, but what we want is more opportunities for women with ASD because they can add so much.
My strengths are making cakes. I'm currently setting up my own business.
I passed my maths GCSE and I'm doing an apprenticeship in hospitality and I'm really enjoying it.
The work's been really amazing because the people that I'm working with really get me.
My daughter has far more talents than issues. Develop those talents and have head teachers rewarded for that, not for exam results.
I would like to see more specialised schools accessible for our children in local areas. And in the meantime, I'd like the mainstream schools to have much better provisions put in place for our children.
All our doctors and nurses to be trained in autism and or learning disability awareness.
Autism should not mean mental health.
We want autism diagnosis to be people-centred, not male-centred.
What I want is early identification for girls so that people don't grow up feeling broken like I did.
8 years to get my daughter diagnosed.
I want schools to understand that when girls are falling apart out of school, are self-harming, have eating disorders, are depressed, have anxiety, that just because it's not happening at school doesn't mean the school doesn't have any responsibility to try and fix that problem.
My strength is singing and songwriting. When you take the time to listen to my language, you'll clearly hear what my heart is saying.
I see autism as my super strength, as it allows myself and my children to be heard.
Even though autism could be hard, I'll never give up. I'm determined and I'm there to help others.
I want to be a teacher when I'm older so I can help people like me.
My strength is pushing myself when everyone else says I can't.
My strength is to speak up for people who cannot speak up for themselves.
I'm good at swimming and singing.
My greatest strength is my empathy with animals.
My strength is following my dreams and never giving up, no matter what challenges get in my way.
What you love?
Mommy, Daddy, Corey and Tango.
I am kind and caring. I'm good at colouring.
My strength is iPads and technology.
My autism helps with my pattern finding and puzzles. Girls can have autism too.
Autism makes me fun.
Girls with autism are sassy.
And actually, autism's been really amazing for me because I wrote a short story about it, it went viral, and now I'm publishing a book.
I like to draw and imagine things and draw the things I imagine.
I'm really good at art and painting.
To finally realise who you are and what you have been is the most profound feeling. When you finally realise, I found my people.
With the right support, I can change the world.
I love that film.
Autistic.
So whether you identify as male or female, gay, straight, non-binary, asexual, whatever, it doesn't matter. Your one and only job is to be more you. You have a right to be yourself in whatever expression of yourself you can. And what I love about that film was people being utterly themselves. And I don't think our diagnostic process should rely on you having one particular mark on your medical record. So I've got a whole host of things that might help you. I've got a handout which I'll send to you as well, which you have access to. I've also done a whole set of podcast episodes which you can get to through my website, which is very easy for you to come to. And my contact details are there. So I hope that's been helpful for you. If you have any questions, then please by all means do ask, and we'll be running a panel session at the end of the week. And hopefully I look forward to seeing you in person soon. Take care. Thanks very much. Look forward to seeing you in person soon. That'd be amazing, won't it? Take care. Bye.